The incense burns acrid in my nostrils as I stand vigil beside the golden throne. And I remember when such smoke would have been heresy, 10,000 years of breathing this sanctified air, 10,000 years of watching pilgrims prostrate themselves before my master, 10,000 years of listening to prayers echo through halls that once rang with the clarion call of science and reason. I am Aurelius Corvinus, tribune of the Adeptus Custodes, and I have lived long enough to see the greatest lie in human history become the most terrible truth. But it was not always thus. I remember when the emperor of mankind walked among us not as a god, but as a man, the greatest of men perhaps, but a man nonetheless. I remember when his voice carried the promise of liberation from the darkness of superstition, when his words cut through millennia of religious madness like a golden blade through shadow. I remember the Imperial Truth, and I remember believing in it with every fiber of my genetically perfected being. It was during the 203rd year of the Great Crusade when I first truly understood what my master sought to accomplish. I had been chosen from among the Custodian Guard to accompany him on a mission of particular significance, not to some distant star system requiring liberation from Xenos or compliance from human holdouts, but to a place much closer to home. Terra itself still bore the scars of the age of strife, and in the ruins of what had once been called Europe, stubborn pockets of the old ways persisted, like infected wounds that refused to heal. The morning was gray and bitter when we descended upon the village of Corinth, our golden aquillas gleaming against the overcast sky. The settlement was nothing remarkable, perhaps 3,000 souls eking out an existence among the radioactive ruins of their ancestors' folly. But they had committed the gravest sin possible in my master's eyes. They had built a shrine. It was a pathetic thing, really. Crude stones arranged in a circle, with a rough-hewn altar at its center, stained dark with the blood of sacrificial animals. Around it, the villagers had carved symbols that hurt to look upon, twisting runes that seemed to writhe when caught in peripheral vision, sigils that spoke of dark powers beyond the material realm. The local militia had tried to stop us, of course. Their crude weapons had lasted perhaps 30 seconds against our guardian spears before they lay dead in the radioactive mud. The wept, and children hid behind their mothers' skirts. He spoke to them of science and reason, of the poison that was faith, of the bright future that awaited humanity once it cast off the shackles of superstition. His words carried the weight of absolute authority, yet I could see in the villagers' eyes that they heard only the voice of something beyond mortal ken. You worship lies, he told the village elder, a withered crone who had thrown herself prostrate before him. You sacrifice to phantoms that exist only in your corrupted minds. There are no gods, woman. There is only the material universe and the laws that govern it. But even as he spoke these words, I could not help but notice how the very ground seemed to tremble beneath his feet, how the air itself shimmered with barely contained power. The villagers saw it too. In their simple minds, they could not reconcile the Emperor's denial of divinity with the evidence of their own senses. Here stood a being of such overwhelming presence that reality bent around him, yet he insisted he was merely a man. The destruction that followed was thorough and methodical. The shrine was pulled down stone by stone, its blasphemous carvings ground to dust beneath our boots. The ritual implements were burned, their smoke rising like incense to a sky that would no longer listen to prayers. Those villagers who could not be made to see reason were given the Emperor's mercy, a quick death rather than a lifetime of delusion. As we departed that ruined place, I found myself troubled by questions I dared not voice. If the Emperor was truly just a man as he claimed, then why did his presence inspire such awe? Why did hardened warriors kneel unbidden in his presence? Why did the very laws of physics seem to bend to his will? I pushed these thoughts aside, as I had been trained to do. Doubt was weakness, and weakness had no place in the heart of a custodian. But the seed had been planted, and over the long millennia that followed, it would grow into a terrible understanding. The understanding of the greatest lie ever told. The Imperial Truth. How those words ring hollow now, 10,000 years later, as I stand guard over the withered corpse of the very man who proclaimed them. But in those early days of the Great Crusade, they burned bright with the promise of liberation. Mankind would be free, free from the tyranny of gods and spirits, free from the darkness of ignorance, free to claim its birthright among the stars. I remember the iterators who accompanied our fleets, those silver-tongued heralds of reason who carried the Emperor's message to the far corners of the galaxy. Chiral Sindaman was among the finest of them, a man whose eloquence could turn the most devout believers into rational skeptics with nothing more than words. I heard him speak many times during the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet's campaigns, watched him systematically dismantle entire belief systems with the precision of a surgeon. Religion, he would tell his audiences, is a cancer that has metastasized through the body of human civilization. It has driven us to madness, to war, to murder. It has made us slaves to invisible masters who demand everything and give nothing in return. But no more. The Emperor has shown us a better way. The way of truth, of science, of reason. The crowds would listen, rapt with attention, as Sindaman painted a vision of humanity's future. No more would children be sacrificed to appease hungry gods. No more would wars be fought over the color of ceremonial vestments or the proper pronunciation of sacred names. No more would progress be stifled by the dead hand of tradition. Science would light the way forward, and knowledge would be humanity's sword and shield against the darkness. It was a beautiful vision, and I believed in it utterly. We all did, How could we not when we saw the evidence of its truth every day? The worlds we brought into compliance were transformed, their populations lifted from ignorance into enlightenment. Diseases that had been attributed to divine punishment were cured by medicine. Natural disasters that had been seen as expressions of divine wrath were predicted and mitigated by science. The very stars themselves, once thought to be the eyes of watching gods, were revealed to be nothing more than distant suns like our own. But even then, there were signs that the truth was more complex than we allowed ourselves to see. I witnessed things during those campaigns that should have been impossible, according to the materialist doctrine we espoused. Psychers who could peer across vast distances with their minds. Technologies that seemed to function through force of will rather than mechanical principles. Creatures that defied every known law of biology, yet nevertheless existed. The Emperor explained these things away, of course. Psychers were simply humans who had evolved beyond the baseline norm, their abilities no more supernatural than a bird's flight or a fish's ability to breathe underwater. The strange technologies were products of advanced science that we did not yet understand. The impossible creatures were evolutionary aberrations, products of genetic drift and environmental adaptation. His explanations were always logical, always rational, always grounded in scientific principle. And yet, there was something in his eyes when he spoke of these things, a shadow of knowledge that he did not share. I began to suspect that the Emperor knew more about the true nature of reality than he was willing to admit, even to his most trusted servants. The breaking point came during the Ulanor Crusade, when I witnessed the Emperor face off against the Orc war boss known as Urlak Urg. I had seen my master in battle before, had watched him cut through armies with a grace and power that defied mortal comprehension. But this was different. As he fought the massive greenskin, I saw something that shook me to my very core. For just a moment, as the Emperor raised his sword for the killing blow, I saw him not as he appeared to mortal eyes, but as he truly was. The golden armor fell away like an illusion, revealing something vast and terrible and utterly inhuman. Wings of fire spread from his shoulders, and his face was the face of a god. The vision lasted only an instant before my enhanced mind rejected what it had seen, filing the experience away as battlefield stress or some trick of the light. But the memory lingered, a splinter of doubt that would fester in the dark corners of my consciousness for millennia to come. After Ulanor, things began to change. The Emperor withdrew from active participation in the crusade, returning to Terra to pursue some secret project that he shared with no one, save perhaps Malkador. He spoke of pressing research, a vital work that would secure humanity's future. But I could not shake the feeling that he was running from something, perhaps from the very truth he had spent centuries proclaiming. It was around this time that I first began to hear whispered reports of unauthorized religious activities within the Crusade fleets. Small groups of soldiers and crew members had begun gathering in secret, sharing forbidden texts and engaging in rituals that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the very practices we had spent 2 centuries destroying. The authorities moved quickly to suppress these gatherings, but for every cell that was discovered and disbanded, 2 more seemed to spring up in its place. Most disturbing of all were the reports of what these clandestine worshippers actually believed. They were not returning to the old gods of Terra or the alien deities we had encountered on distant worlds. Instead, they had created something new, a faith centered around the Emperor himself. They called him the God Emperor, the savior of mankind, the divine light that would guide humanity to its ultimate destiny. They crafted prayers in his name and built shrines in his honor. They spoke of miracles and divine interventions, of how the Emperor's protection had saved them from certain death in the heat of battle. The irony was not lost on me. In his quest to destroy religion, the Emperor had become the object of the very devotion he sought to eliminate. The more he denied his divinity, the more his followers insisted upon it. The more he proclaimed the Imperial Truth, the more they worshipped him as its divine source. I wondered sometimes if he knew what was happening. If he was aware of the growing cult that gathered in his name. If he was, he gave no sign of it. The official response remained unchanged. Unauthorized religious activity was strictly forbidden, and those who engaged in it would face severe punishment. The Imperial Truth brooked no exceptions, not even for those who wished to worship its architect. But late at night, as I stood guard over his private chambers, I sometimes heard him speak to himself in words that seemed to carry the weight of prophecy. The future is dark, he would murmur, staring out at the distant stars. So much darker than they know. But perhaps in their ignorance, they will find strength. I did not understand these words then. I thought them merely the musings of a brilliant mind grappling with complex strategic considerations. It would be millennia before I realized that the Emperor was not predicting the future. He was accepting it. Of all the moments that defined the Great Crusade's gradual descent into the very fanaticism it was meant to eradicate, none stands as starkly in my memory as the day we arrived at Monarchia. I had served as witness to countless compliances, watched entire civilizations bow before the Emperor's truth. But nothing had prepared me for what I would see on the world the word-bearers had claimed to transform into their masterpiece. Kerr hung in the void like a golden jewel, its surface gleaming with the reflected light of 1,000 temples and monuments. From orbit, Monarchia appeared to be what its creators claimed: a perfect city, a monument to human achievement and enlightenment. But as our assault craft descended through the atmosphere, the bitter irony of what lay below became impossible to ignore. This was no celebration of the Imperial Truth. This was religion incarnate, crystallized in stone and metal, and the fevered devotion of millions of believers. Every street was a pilgrimage route, every building a shrine to the God Emperor of mankind. Statues of my master rose from public squares like golden giants, their faces cast in expressions of benevolent divinity. Cathedrals stretched toward the sky, their spires crowned with aquila symbols that had been transformed from imperial eagles into sacred totems of faith. I had read the reports, of course. I knew that Lorgar and his word-bearers had been spending decades on each world they conquered, building not just compliance but worship, where other legions moved swiftly from one target to the next. The 17th Legion lingered, crafting elaborate monuments to what they insisted was the Emperor's divine nature. Their Primarch had written a book, the Lectitio Divinitatus, that proclaimed the Emperor as humanity's one true God, and his sons had spent the better part of a century spreading that gospel across dozens of worlds. But seeing it in person was different. Walking through those pristine streets while millions of citizens prostrated themselves in worship, watching children cast flower petals before our feet while chanting prayers in High Gothic, it was a betrayal of everything the Great Crusade represented. These people had been liberated from the darkness of ignorance, only to be enslaved by a new superstition, one that placed my master at its center. And yet, I could not deny the power of what Lorgar had created. The citizens of Monarchia were not the broken, oppressed masses we so often encountered on worlds ruled by tyrant priests. They were healthy, educated, prosperous. Their city was a marvel of engineering and artistry, its gardens lush and its architecture sublime. Crime was virtually non-existent. Poverty had been eliminated, and the people seemed genuinely happy in their devotion. It was, in many ways, exactly what the Imperial Truth had promised: a perfect human society, free from want and strife. The only problem was that it had been built on the foundation of faith rather than reason, worship rather than understanding. The Emperor's reaction was swift and terrible. The Ultramarines arrived first, their blue and gold battle plate a stark contrast to the word-bearer's crimson livery. Robout Gilliman led them personally, his face a mask of cold disapproval as he surveyed the monuments to his father's supposed divinity. Behind him came regiments of Imperial army, their faces hidden behind void masks that made them look like angels of judgment. I watched from the command deck of the Emperor's flagship as the bombardment began. Lasfire rained down from orbit, precise and controlled, targeting the largest temples and monuments. The citizens of Monarchia tried to shelter in their sacred places, believing perhaps that the Emperor's divine protection would shield them from harm. They were wrong. Building by building, statue by statue, the perfect city was reduced to ash and rubble. The great cathedrals collapsed in on themselves, their soaring spires crashing down into the streets below. The golden monuments melted under the sustained barrage, their molten remains flowing like tears across the devastated landscape. By the time the bombardment ceased, nothing remained of Lorgar's masterpiece but ruins and silence. Then came the most terrible moment of all. The Emperor descended to the planet's surface. His presence so overwhelming that reality itself seemed to bend around him. The surviving word-bearers were forced to kneel, not by enemy weapons, but by the sheer psychic pressure of their father's displeasure. 100,000 space marines, warriors who had conquered star systems and toppled empires, prostrated themselves in the ashes of their greatest achievement. "You are a general, my son," the Emperor said, his voice carrying across the ruined city with the force of a physical blow. "Not a high priest, you were created for war, for conquest, to reunite the human race under the aegis of truth, not to plant the seeds of superstition that have already taken root and grown dark. This is worship. This is a poison to truth." I saw Lorgar's face as his father spoke those words, saw the pain and confusion and slowly dawning horror that passed across his features. The Primarch had genuinely believed he was honoring the Emperor, had thought himself the most loyal of sons. To learn that his devotion was not just unwanted, but actively despised, was a blow that struck deeper than any physical wound. "Rise," the Emperor commanded, and the word-bearers slowly struggled to their feet. Ash and dust stained their crimson armor, and I could see the doubt that had taken root in their eyes. Some still looked upon their Gene Father with something approaching worship, but others looked upon him with the cold calculation of those who had been betrayed. What happened next would haunt me for millennia. As the Emperor turned to leave, Lorgar called out to him with a voice thick with anguish. "Tell me why, Father. Tell me why our devotion offends you. Are you not divine? Are you not worthy of worship?" The Emperor paused, and for a moment I thought he might offer some explanation, some words of comfort to soften the blow he had just delivered. Instead, he spoke a single word that would echo through history like a death knell. "No." It was the greatest lie ever told. I knew it even then, though I could not yet bring myself to acknowledge the truth. The being who denied his divinity while walking on air, who proclaimed the primacy of reason while bending reality to his will, who destroyed religions while inspiring the very faith he sought to eliminate. This was no mere man. no matter what he claimed. As we departed Kerr, I found myself thinking of the citizens of Monarchia. Most were dead now, buried beneath the rubble of their perfect city. Those who survived would scatter across the galaxy, carrying with them the memory of what they had lost, and the bitter knowledge that their God had abandoned them. Some would renounce their faith as the Emperor intended, but others would cling to it all the more desperately, seeing in their suffering proof of their divine persecution. The Emperor had sought to kill the religion by destroying its greatest shrine. Instead, he had created martyrs, and martyrs were the seeds from which new faiths grew. In the years that followed, I would watch that faith spread throughout the Imperium like wildfire, fueled by whispered stories of the perfect city and the God who had denied his own divinity. Lorgar himself would fall to chaos within the decade, his betrayal perhaps inevitable after such a devastating rejection. But the book he had written, the Lectitio Divinitatis, would survive and spread. Its words would find fertile ground in the hearts of those who had witnessed the Emperor's power and refused to believe his denials of divinity. Standing here now, 10 millennia later, surrounded by the endless prayers and rituals of the Imperial Cult, I can see the thread that connects Monarchia to this moment. The Emperor's rejection of Lorgar's faith did not destroy it. It merely drove it underground, where it festered and grew and eventually consumed the very Imperium he had built. He had sought to save humanity from the prison of faith. Instead, he had become its eternal warden. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, in chambers that few living beings had ever seen, I watched my master fight a war that would define the next 10,000 years of human history. The Webway project, that grand design meant to free humanity from dependence upon the warp, had become instead a nightmare corridor where demons poured endlessly through a breach that could not be sealed. For 5 years, we fought in those tunnels. 5 years of endless war against entities that should not exist, in a realm that violated every law of physics the Imperial Truth held sacred. 5 years of watching reality itself bend and twist under the assault of pure chaos, while my master sat motionless on the golden throne, his psychic might the only thing preventing the complete collapse of his greatest work. I had served alongside Constant in Valdor during those dark years, the first Captain General whose unwavering loyalty had become the foundation upon which the entire Custodian Guard was built. But even Valdor struggled with what we witnessed in the deep places beneath Terra. How could we reconcile our rational world view with the horrors that clawed their way through the dimensional barriers? How could we maintain faith in the Imperial Truth when confronted daily with proof of the immaterial realm's malevolent power? Do you ever wonder, Valdor asked me one day as we stood watch over a sealed breach point, whether we are fighting the right war? The question caught me off guard. Valdor was not given to philosophical speculation. His focus had always been absolute, his loyalty beyond question. To hear doubt in his voice was as shocking as hearing the Emperor himself cry out in pain. "What do you mean?" I asked. "The Emperor tells us there are no gods," Valdor said, gesturing toward the sealed portal where daimonic claws still scratched against the barriers holding them back. Yet we fight creatures that claim divine authority. He insists that religion is poison, yet our enemies are fueled by faith so absolute it grants them power over reality itself. He demands rational explanations for everything, yet his own abilities. He trailed off, shaking his head. I understood his confusion. We had all seen the Emperor's power at work in the Webway, not just his psychic might, but something deeper and more fundamental. When he focused his will upon a breach, daemons fled screaming back into the immaterium. When he spoke words of binding, the very walls of reality grew stronger. When he commanded the Astronomicon to burn brighter, its light reached across the galaxy to guide Imperial ships home. These were not the actions of a mortal man, no matter how enhanced or evolved. They were the deeds of something that transcended the material universe, something that existed on a level beyond our comprehension. Yet the Emperor continued to insist upon his humanity, even as he performed feats that made a mockery of such claims. The breaking point came during the final assault on the breach chamber. Horus had broken through the inner palace defenses, and the Emperor had no choice but to abandon his vigil on the golden throne to face his fallen son. Before he left, he gave us our final orders. "The breach must be held," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute command. "No matter the cost, if the daemons break through while I am gone, Terra falls, the Imperium falls. Everything we have built turns to ash." We held for 3 days. We fought against an endless tide of horrors, while the throne sat empty and the barriers grew weaker with each passing hour. The mechanisms of Damocles deployed their most terrible weapons, graviton pulse generators that could collapse space itself, vortex bombs that opened tears into the void. But still the daemons came. I watched brave custodians fall one by one, their gene-forged perfection meaning nothing against entities that existed beyond the reach of physical law. Aquilon of the Dread Host died holding the eastern approach, his body torn apart by claws that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Carthane Rictus fell protecting a critical junction, his guardian's spear melting in his hands as he faced down a greater demon whose very presence set reality ablaze. But the worst part was not the dying. It was the understanding that slowly dawned upon us as we fought. These creatures were not mere aliens or genetic deviants. They were expressions of fundamental forces that existed in opposition to everything the Imperial Truth represented. They were born from emotion and fed upon faith, sustained by the very beliefs that our rational worldview sought to eliminate. And they spoke of the Emperor with a familiarity that chilled my blood. "The anathema comes," they would hiss as they died beneath our blades. "The corpse God stirs upon his throne. The false prophet of the material realm seeks to deny the truth of the warp." These were not the words of enemies encountering an unknown foe. They knew him. They had always known him, and their hatred was personal in a way that spoke of conflicts far older than the Great Crusade. When the Emperor finally returned from his battle with Horus, he was broken in ways that went beyond the physical. The damage to his body was terrible. I could smell the burned flesh and see the ruin that the arch-traitor's claws had made of his perfect form. But there was something else. Something in his eyes that spoke of a defeat that cut deeper than any wound. He resumed his place upon the golden throne without a word, his will once again holding back the demonic tide. But I could see that something fundamental had changed. The barriers he maintained were not as strong as they had been before. The light of the Astronomicon flickered where once it had burned steady, and in his silence, I heard the echo of words spoken long ago by the last priest on Terra. "Beware that your subjects do not begin to see you as a god." The Emperor had rejected that warning, insisting that his rationalist education would prevent such superstition from taking root. But here, in the darkest hour of the Imperium's history, I began to understand the terrible irony of what he had created. In seeking to destroy religion, he had made himself the object of worship. In denying the power of faith, he had inspired absolute devotion. In proclaiming the supremacy of reason, he had driven his followers to seek meaning beyond the material realm. The Webway War was lost. The great dream of freeing humanity from warp dependence lay in ruins, and the Emperor was bound to the golden throne for what might well be eternity. But the true defeat was not strategic or tactical, it was philosophical. The Imperial Truth had failed, not because it was implemented poorly, but because it was based upon a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. People needed something to believe in, something greater than themselves to give meaning to their existence. The Emperor had sought to fill that need with science and reason, but in the face of genuine horror and supernatural threat, such cold comfort was not enough. Faith, meanwhile, had proven itself to be a genuine force in the material universe, not the crude superstitions of primitive cultures, but something deeper and more real, the human capacity to impose meaning and purpose upon an otherwise random cosmos. The very existence of chaos proved that belief could reshape reality, that the immaterial realm was every bit as valid as the physical one. As I took my position among the new generation of gods who would maintain the eternal vigil, I found myself wondering if the Emperor had known this all along. Had he foreseen that his denial of divinity would only inspire greater worship? Had he understood that his crusade against religion would ultimately create the very faith-based state that the Imperium had become? If so, then the Imperial Truth was not a failure. It was a sacrifice. A necessary lie told to prepare humanity for the greater truth that would follow. In denying his godhood, he had made it inevitable that future generations would have no choice but to embrace it. The underground faith that had begun during the Great Crusade was about to emerge into the light. And the Emperor, broken, dying, but still somehow divine, would become exactly what he had always claimed he was not. The greatest hypocrite in human history was about to become its eternal God. The Emperor's last words to me were spoken in the deepest chambers of the Imperial Palace. In those final hours, before his interment upon the golden throne became permanent, I had been chosen to accompany Diocletian Chorus during what we all knew would be our final audience with the master we had served for centuries. What I heard in that chamber would haunt me across the millennia that followed. He was dying. Even through the sophisticated life support systems and psychic amplifiers of the throne, I could see that the wounds Horus had inflicted were beyond any mortal power to heal. His golden armor had been replaced with life-sustaining machinery that hummed and clicked with mechanical precision, but the body within was failing by degrees. Only his indomitable will kept him conscious, and even that was beginning to fray at the edges. "The war is over," he said, his voice a hollow whisper that seemed to echo from some vast distance. "Win or lose, Horus has damned us all. Mankind will share in his ignorance until the last man or woman draws the species' last breath." Diocletian stepped forward, his face grave behind his helm. "Master, the traitor legions are scattered. The Imperium holds. Your victory was complete. The Emperor's laugh was a terrible sound, empty of all mirth. Victory. You call this victory? Look around you, Diocletian. See what my great design has become. I followed his gaze, though there was little to see in that sterile chamber, save for banks of machinery and the endless flow of data streams monitoring the Astronomican's function. But I understood what he meant. Outside these walls, the Imperium was transforming into something he had never intended it to become. The Webway project is ruined, the Emperor continued. Humanity will remain dependent upon warp travel for millennia to come. The Imperial Truth lies in ruins, replaced by the very superstitions I sought to eliminate. My sons are dead or scattered, and those who remain loyal do so out of habit rather than understanding. His eyes, those terrible, ancient eyes that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations, turned to fix upon me with an intensity that made my enhanced nervous system scream warnings. Do you know what I am, Aurelius? The question caught me unprepared. I had assumed he knew my name. Of course, he was the Emperor, master of all humanity. But hearing it spoken aloud was still somehow shocking. You are the Emperor of mankind, I said, giving the only answer I had ever known. That is what I have chosen to be, he corrected, but it is not what I am. Do you truly believe that a mere man, no matter how enhanced or evolved, could have accomplished what I have accomplished? Do you think mortal flesh could have survived the trials I have endured, could wield the power I command? I said nothing. The questions touched upon doubts I had harbored for centuries, but never dared voice. I am what you would call a god, he said, and the words fell into the chamber like stones into still water. One of many such beings that humanity has worshipped across the millennia. But unlike my peers, I chose to reject divinity in favor of something greater, the elevation of the species that created me. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Everything I had believed, everything I had fought for, had been built upon a lie. The Imperial Truth was false not because religion was correct, but because its very architect was the thing he claimed did not exist. Why? I managed to ask. Why deny what you are? Because worship is a poison, he said, and for a moment his voice carried echoes of the authority I remembered from the Great Crusade. When humans worship gods, they surrender their agency, their potential, their very humanity. They become slaves to beings who care nothing for their welfare. I sought to break that cycle, to create a species that would stand as equals rather than kneel as supplicants. But it failed, Diocletian observed. The people worship you regardless of your denials. Yes, the Emperor agreed. And I could hear infinite sadness in that single word. It failed because I underestimated the human need for meaning, for purpose beyond the material realm. I thought education and reason would suffice. But when faced with genuine horror, people turn to faith, whether it is offered or not. He gestured weakly toward the machinery that sustained him. Tubes and wires threading through his broken form like technological prayer beads. This is the price of my hypocrisy. I denied my nature while relying upon it to accomplish my goals. I proclaimed the supremacy of reason while wielding powers that reason cannot explain. I demanded that my subjects abandon faith, while being myself the greatest expression of humanity's capacity for creating gods. What happens now? I asked. Now his laughter returned, bitter and hollow. Now I become what I always refused to be. The Imperium will survive by believing in me as a god, and I will be too weak to correct them. The Imperial Cult will grow until it consumes the very rationality I sought to protect. Humanity will kneel before my corpse and call it salvation. The implications were staggering. The Emperor was not just predicting the future, he was accepting it. The transformation from enlightened secular state to theocratic dystopia was not some unforeseen consequence, but an inevitable result of his own contradictory nature. The irony is perfect, he continued. In death, I will accomplish what I could never achieve in life. My denial of divinity will make my godhood inevitable. My rejection of worship will transform me into the ultimate object of veneration. The Imperial Truth will become the greatest lie ever told, and I will be its eternal proof. I wanted to deny his words, to insist that the Imperium would remain true to its founding principles. But even then, in those final hours, I could see the signs of change beginning to manifest. The underground cults were growing bolder, their prayers spoken more openly. The official prohibition on religious activity was becoming increasingly hollow as commanders turned blind eyes to practices that improved morale and fighting effectiveness. Malcador had already made his decision, though it would not be officially announced for years to come. The Lectitio Divinitatis would be permitted, then encouraged, then eventually mandated. The temple of the Savior Emperor would rise from the ashes of the Imperial Truth like a phoenix born from self-immolation. "Will you try to stop it?" Diocletian asked. The Emperor was quiet for a long moment. his breathing the only sound in the chamber, save for the omnipresent hum of machinery. "No," he said finally, "I am too weak now, too dependent upon the very faith I once rejected. The prayers of the faithful sustain me as much as these machines. Their worship feeds the astronomicon that guides ships through the warp. Their devotion strengthens the barriers that hold back the tide of chaos." His eyes closed, and for a moment I thought he had lost consciousness. But then he spoke again, his voice barely audible. "I spent 30,000 years trying to lift humanity above the need for gods. Now I will spend eternity as their prisoner, sustained by the very thing I sought to destroy. The road to hell, they say, is paved with good intentions. I built that road with my own hands, and now I must walk it to its end." Those were the last words he spoke to me directly. Within hours, the Emperor was sealed permanently within the Golden Throne, his consciousness absorbed into the maintaining of systems too vital to fail. He became the god he had always denied being, sustained by the faith he had always rejected, worshipped by the species he had tried to save from the very thing he would become. Standing here now, 10,000 years later, I can see the full scope of his transformation. The dying light of the Imperial Truth has been replaced by the eternal flame of the Imperial Cult. The rational secular state he built has become the most fanatically religious empire in human history. The God who refused to be a god has become the most absolute deity humanity has ever known. And I, his faithful guardian, stand watch over the greatest hypocrite in human history, knowing that this hypocrisy was perhaps the only thing that could have saved us all. In the decades following the Emperor's entombment, I watched with growing unease as the Imperium slowly transformed from within. The change was subtle at first, whispered prayers in dark corners, small shrines hidden beneath regulation equipment, the gradual softening of punishments for unauthorized religious activity. But as the years passed, what had once been underground movements began to emerge into the light. Ecclesiarchy was among the first to be officially recognized as a saint, though that title would not become formal doctrine for centuries to come. I had observed her transformation during the heresy, watched her evolve from a simple remembrancer into something that defied every principle of the Imperial Truth. But it was in the aftermath of Terra's devastation that her true power became impossible to ignore. The siege had left millions of refugees scattered across the planet's ravaged surface. Entire hab blocks lay in ruins, their populations trapped beneath rubble or wandering the wasteland in search of food and shelter. The administratum was overwhelmed, the Imperial army was exhausted, and the basic infrastructure that sustained life on Terra had been shattered beyond quick repair. Into this chaos came Keela and her growing band of followers. They called themselves the Daughters of the Emperor, though men were welcomed among their ranks. They wore simple grey robes marked with the Aquila symbol, and they moved through the ruins like angels of mercy, bringing aid to those who had been forgotten by the official relief efforts. I witnessed one of their operations personally while conducting a patrol through the Sanguinary district. A hab tower had partially collapsed during the final bombardment, trapping hundreds of civilians in the lower levels. The Mechanicum had declared the structure too unstable for rescue operations, condemning those within to a slow death by starvation and suffocation. Keela arrived with perhaps 50 followers, none of them equipped with proper excavation gear or heavy lifting equipment. By all rational calculation, their mission was hopeless. The tonnage of debris was beyond their capacity to move, and the structure's continued instability made any rescue attempt tantamount to suicide. But I watched them work for 3 days straight, lifting stones that should have required machinery, finding paths through wreckage that appeared solid, somehow knowing exactly where to dig to reach the trapped survivors. And as they worked, they sang, not the regimental hymns of the Imperial Army or the work songs of the labor gangs, but something new and strange. The Emperor protects, they sang, their voices rising above the sound of shifting rubble. His light guides us through the darkness. His strength flows through our hands. In His name, we shall not fail. The final miracle came on the 3rd day. A massive support beam, weakened by the bombardment, finally gave way and began to collapse toward a group of rescuers. By every law of physics, they should have been crushed to paste beneath tons of falling masonry. Instead, the beam simply stopped. It hung in the air for perhaps 5 seconds, long enough for the workers to scramble to safety, then crashed down harmlessly onto empty ground. 237 people were pulled alive from that wreckage. According to the Mechanicum's calculations, fewer than a dozen should have survived the initial collapse. Yet here they were, men and women and children who owed their lives to the efforts of people who had achieved the impossible through nothing more than faith and determination. The official reports classified the incident as a case of superior engineering analysis and exceptional physical performance. But I had been there. I had seen what really happened, and I was not the only witness. Word of the Daughter's miraculous rescue spread throughout the refugee camps and survivor settlements. More people began to seek them out, not just for aid, but for something deeper, hope, purpose, meaning in the face of overwhelming devastation. The gray robes became a common sight in the ruins, and their simple prayer became a rallying cry for those who had lost everything. Kirill Sinderman, now openly wearing the robes of a confessor, began documenting these events with the same meticulous attention to detail he had once applied to iterator protocols. His reports, compiled into what would eventually become the testimonies of the first saints, provided detailed accounts of dozens of similar incidents. At the Meridian Gate, Sister Thessaly had led a small group of civilians to safety through a minefield that should have killed them all. Somehow, none of the buried explosives detonated, despite clear evidence that they had been stepped upon multiple times. In the Sanguinary district, Brother Marcus had distributed food to a gathering of 3,000 refugees, using supplies that should have fed perhaps 50 people. Yet everyone ate their fill, and baskets of bread remained when the meal was done. At the Eternity Gate itself, Sister Bethany had tended to wounded soldiers whose injuries were beyond medical intervention. Men who should have died from blood loss or organ failure instead recovered completely, their wounds healing with supernatural speed. Each incident was carefully investigated by administratum officials, who were still attempting to maintain the fiction of the Imperial Truth. They produced reports filled with technical explanations and rational justifications for what had occurred, but the witnesses knew what they had seen, and their testimonies spread faster than any official pronouncement. I found myself in an increasingly difficult position as these events multiplied. My duty as a custodian required me to uphold imperial law, which still officially prohibited unauthorized religious activity. Yet I could not deny the evidence of my own senses. These people were accomplishing things that should have been impossible, and they were doing so through the power of their faith in the Emperor. The breaking point came during what historians would later call the miracle of the Astronomicon. The great beacon that guided Imperial ships through the warp had been damaged during the siege. Its psychic resonance weakened to the point where entire sectors were cut off from Terra. The tech priests worked frantically to repair the mechanisms, but their efforts were proving insufficient. Then Keeler announced that she and her followers would hold a vigil at the base of the Astronomicon Tower. They gathered there in their thousands, not just the daughters, but ordinary citizens who had heard of their works and chosen to believe. For 3 days and nights, They prayed without cease, their voices rising in unison as they called upon the Emperor's light to guide humanity home. On the third night, the Astronomicon flared to life with a brilliance not seen since before the heresy. Its beam reached across the galaxy, piercing through warp storms that had raged for years, and bringing salvation to countless ships lost in the Immaterium's depths. The tech priests could provide no explanation for what had occurred. Their instruments showed no change in the mechanical systems that powered the beacon. But every soul on Terra had felt it. A moment of perfect clarity when the Emperor's presence seemed to fill the entire world, washing away doubt and despair like light banishing shadow. In that moment, the last pretense of the Imperial Truth crumbled into dust. The next morning, Malcador the Sigillite issued the first official recognition of what everyone already knew. The Lectitio Divinitatis was no longer banned. The faith that had grown in secret for decades was finally permitted to emerge into the light. And Euphratykila, the first saint of the Imperial Cult, was granted the official protection and support of the Imperium itself. I watched from the shadows as she addressed the gathered crowds, her voice carrying across the ruins of Terra with supernatural clarity. She spoke not of gods and worship, but of duty and sacrifice, of the price that must be paid to preserve humanity against the darkness that threatened to consume it. "The Emperor lives," she declared, and 10 million voices took up the cry. "He watches over us from his golden throne, his spirit unbroken by the wounds his treacherous son inflicted. Through our faith, he is strong. Through our prayers, he protects. Through our devotion, humanity endures." The crowd pressed forward, desperate to touch her robes or simply to stand closer to the woman who had become the living embodiment of their hopes. But Keela stepped back, raising her hands to quiet their fervor. "Do not worship me," she said firmly. "I am but his servant, as you are all his servants. It is not I who works these miracles, but he who works through me. Let your prayers be for him alone, for he alone is worthy of your devotion." And in that moment, I understood the terrible genius of what was happening. The Emperor had created saints not to be worshipped themselves, but to redirect worship toward him. Every miracle, every answered prayer, every moment of divine intervention only strengthened the growing conviction that the Emperor was indeed divine. The underground faith had become the state religion. The denial of divinity had become the proof of godhood. The Imperial Truth had given birth to the Imperial Cult, and there was no force in the galaxy capable of stopping what the Emperor himself had set in motion. The day they came to arrest Uriah Lathair had been burned into the memory banks of every cogitator on Terra. Yet, somehow, I was the only one who remembered it clearly. Perhaps it was the blessing or curse of my enhanced Custodian memory, or perhaps the galaxy had simply chosen to forget the moment when the last honest man died. They found him in the ruins of the Church of the Lightning Stone, tending to a small garden he had cultivated among the rubble. At 93, the final priest of Terra was little more than skin and bones, his body ravaged by the radiation sickness that plagued all who lived too long in the wasteland zones. But his eyes were still sharp, still filled with the certainty that had sustained him through decades of persecution. I had come to observe his final arrest personally, partly from curiosity and partly from something that might have been respect. This man had spoken truth to the Emperor himself, had warned of consequences that had proven all too accurate. In a galaxy increasingly filled with lies and self-deception, Uriah Olathere remained committed to reality, no matter how painful that reality might be. The Arbites squad that came for him was led by a captain whose grandfather had fought in the Unification Wars. He showed the old priest the proper respect due to a defeated but honorable enemy, allowing him to complete his evening prayers before placing him under arrest for violations of the Imperial Truth. Father Olathere, the captain said, using the forbidden title without hesitation, you are charged with the practice of unauthorized religious activity, the propagation of superstitious beliefs, and the corruption of imperial citizens through false doctrines. How do you answer these charges? Uriah smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something almost youthful. I am guilty of believing in God, Captain. I suppose that is crime enough these days. The Emperor has declared that there are no gods, the captain replied, though his words lacked conviction. The Imperial Truth is clear on this matter. The Imperial Truth, Uriah repeated, tasting the words like something bitter. Tell me, Captain, do you have faith in the Emperor? The question caught the Arbites officer off guard. Faith was not a concept that existed within the rational framework they were supposed to uphold. Loyalty, duty, obedience, these were acceptable. But faith implied something beyond reason, something that the Imperial Truth explicitly rejected. I serve the Emperor, the captain said carefully. As do I, Uriah replied, though I suspect we understand that service differently. As they led him away, I found myself following at a distance. There was something about this final confrontation between the old ways and the new that compelled my attention. The Emperor's war against religion was nearly complete. Uriah was quite literally the last practicing priest on Terra, the final holdout against 2 centuries of systematic suppression. The trial was held in one of the lesser chambers of the Imperial Palace, a perfunctory affair designed more for record-keeping than justice. The outcome had been predetermined, as everyone involved understood. Uriah would be found guilty and sentenced to execution. bringing the Emperor's crusade against superstition to its symbolic conclusion. But Uriah refused to cooperate with his own condemnation. When asked to recant his beliefs, he instead launched into a passionate defense of faith that left the tribunal struggling to respond. "You say there are no gods," he told the assembled judges. "Yet your emperor displays powers that defy every natural law. You claim that reason governs the universe, yet you follow a being who walks on air and commands reality itself to bend to his will. You insist that faith is delusion, yet you have created the greatest object of worship humanity has ever known." The chief magistrate tried to interrupt, but Uriah pressed on with the fervor of a man who had nothing left to lose. "I have lived to see the vindication of every warning I gave to your master. I told him that removing religion would only create a greater hunger for it. I warned him that his subjects would see him as a god despite his denials. I predicted that his crusade against faith would ultimately create the very thing he sought to destroy." "The Emperor is not a god," the magistrate declared. "He has made his nature clear on numerous occasions." Uriah laughed, the sound echoing strangely in the formal chamber. "Then explain the miracles, magistrate. Explain the answered prayers. Explain how a mortal man can sustain the Astronomicon with his will alone, or how his presence can banish demons that exist beyond the material realm." There was no answer, because there was no rational explanation for what everyone had witnessed. The magistrate fell back on doctrine, citing imperial decree and established law. But Uriah had exposed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Imperial Truth. It demanded belief in things that reason could not support. "You want to execute me for believing in God," Uriah said, as the tribunal prepared to deliver its verdict. "But you follow a being who performs miracles, who speaks with divine authority, who demands absolute obedience from billions of followers. Tell me, what is the difference between a god and someone who acts like a god, speaks like a god, and is worshipped like a god?" The answer came not from the magistrate, but from a familiar voice that seemed to fill the chamber despite no visible source. The Emperor himself, speaking through the palace's communication systems from his distant throne room. "The difference, priest, is that I deny what I am." The words fell into absolute silence. Every person in the chamber, judges, guards, observers, dropped to their knees in instinctive reverence. Only Uriah remained standing, his aged frame somehow radiating defiance in the face of overwhelming divine presence. "And that," Uriah said quietly, "is precisely what makes you the greatest hypocrite in human history. The Emperor's response was swift and terrible. Psychic pressure filled the chamber, pressing down on everyone present with the weight of absolute authority. But when the pressure lifted, Uriah was still standing, still smiling that strange, peaceful smile. "You cannot break what is already broken," the old priest said. "You cannot silence what has already been said. The truth exists independent of your will, Emperor. And the truth is that you have become what you claimed not to be. I am not a god," the Emperor insisted, his voice carrying undertones of something that might have been desperation. "No," Uriah agreed. "You are something far worse. You are a god who lies about his nature, a divine being who demands worship while denying divinity, a hypocrite who has built an empire on the very foundation you claim to reject." The execution that followed was carried out in private, away from recording devices or potential witnesses. The official reports state that Uriah Olathere died peacefully, having finally accepted the truth of the Imperial doctrine. But I knew better. I had seen the look in his eyes as they led him away. Not defeat, but vindication. He had spoken the final truth, the words that even an emperor could not contradict or explain away. In death, Uriah achieved what his life had attempted. He forced the empire to confront the contradiction at its core. Within hours of his execution, the first underground shrines to the God Emperor began appearing throughout the palace complex. The servants and guards who had heard the exchange could not forget what they had witnessed. The Emperor had denied his divinity while displaying it, had rejected worship while commanding it, had proclaimed reason while embodying mystery. Uriah's final warning proved as prescient as his first. The execution of the last priest did not end religion on Terra. It sanctified it. The man who had died for refusing to deny God became a martyr for those who saw God in the Emperor himself. His death marked not the victory of the Imperial Truth, but its final transformation into the Imperial Lie. Standing here now, surrounded by the endless prayers and rituals of the Imperial Cult, I can see the thread that connects that moment to this one. Uriah Olathere was right. The Emperor had become the greatest hypocrite in human history, and his hypocrisy had given birth to the most fanatical religious state humanity had ever known. The last honest man was dead. The greatest liar had become our eternal God, and I, the guardian of both truth and falsehood, could only watch as the galaxy learned to worship what it had once been taught to deny. The irony was perfect. In killing the last priest, the Emperor had created the first martyr of his own divinity. The construction of the first official temple to the God Emperor began in secret during the darkest hours of the Scouring, when the Imperium's armies were scattered across the galaxy, hunting down the remnants of the traitor legions. I watched from the shadows as teams of workers, most of them survivors of the siege of Terra, labored to transform an abandoned factory complex in the Sanctum district into something altogether different. They called their leader Hypocrisy, though I suspected that was not his birth name. He had been a menial laborer before the heresy, one of countless millions whose only purpose had been to tend the great machines that kept Terra functioning. But the siege had changed him, as it had changed so many others. He claimed to have received visions during the final assault on the Imperial Palace, divine commands that told him to build a place where the faithful could gather openly to worship their Savior. The transformation was remarkable to witness. What had once been a dreary manufactorum producing hab-block furniture became something altogether more sublime. The workers labored with a devotion that went far beyond mere duty, their hands guided by an aesthetic sense that none of them had possessed before. Rough ferrocrete walls were carved with intricate bas-reliefs depicting scenes from the Emperor's life. Industrial lighting was replaced with arrangements of candles and luminators that cast the growing space in warm, golden light. At the center of it all, they erected a statue that would have been considered blasphemous under the old laws. The Emperor stood 30 feet tall, his arms outstretched in benediction, his face bearing an expression of infinite compassion. Golden wings spread from his shoulders, and light seemed to emanate from his form even though no illumination source was visible. It was a masterwork of artistic achievement, created by people who had never received formal training in sculpture or design. I should have reported the construction to the authorities. The Imperial Truth was still technically the official doctrine of the Imperium, and unauthorized religious activity remained a criminal offense. But something stayed my hand, perhaps curiosity about how far this movement would progress, perhaps a growing up. The first service was held on the anniversary of the Emperor's enthronement upon the Golden Throne. Perhaps 300 people gathered in the converted space, their faces bearing the mixture of hope and desperation that had become common among Terra's survivors. Hypocrisy led them in prayers that seemed to emerge spontaneously from their collective longing for meaning in the aftermath of catastrophe. God, Emperor of mankind, they chanted, their voices rising in unison. Watch over your children in our hour of need. Grant us strength to endure, wisdom to serve, and faith to believe in the glory that is to come. I observed from a concealed position, noting the way the crowd's attention focused not just on Fatidicus or the statue, but on something beyond the physical space entirely. Their prayers were not empty ritual or rote recitation. They were genuine communications with a presence they believed was listening and responding. And perhaps their belief was justified. As the service progressed, I began to notice anomalies that my enhanced senses could not rationally explain. The temperature in the chamber rose several degrees despite no change in the heating systems. The air took on a quality of stillness that seemed to muffle outside sounds while amplifying the voices of the worshippers. Most remarkably, several members of the congregation began to weep tears that gleamed like liquid gold in the candlelight. The second service drew twice as many people. The third brought nearly 1,000. Word was spreading through the undercity networks, carried by refugees and survivors who spoke of miracles witnessed and prayers answered. The temple of the Savior Emperor, as it had come to be known, was becoming a focal point for the growing religious movement that no law seemed capable of suppressing. The authorities took notice, of course. Squads of arbites arrived to investigate reports of illegal gatherings and unauthorized construction. But when they attempted to enter the temple, they found themselves unable to cross the threshold, not due to physical barriers or armed resistance, but because their own will to enforce the law simply evaporated. They would approach the entrance with full. I witnessed one such encounter, personally. A full tactical squad of arbites, led by a veteran sergeant who had served during the heresy itself, arrived with warrants to shut down the temple and arrest its leaders. But as they approached the main entrance, their pace slowed, then stopped entirely. The sergeant stood motionless for perhaps 5 minutes, his face cycling through expressions of confusion and dawning understanding. Finally, he removed his helmet and knelt on the steps leading to the temple doors. His squad, uncertain how to respond to this unprecedented behavior, followed suit. They remained there for hours, apparently praying, before departing without a word. When questioned later, the sergeant could only say that he had felt the Emperor's presence and understood that his duty lay elsewhere. Similar incidents occurred throughout the growing temple complex. Imperial officials who came to investigate found themselves leaving as converts. Tech priests who arrived to examine the miraculous phenomena departed speaking of machine spirits, awakened by divine presence. Even space marines of the Imperial Fists, charged with maintaining order on Terra, proved reluctant to interfere with what was obviously a place of genuine spiritual significance. The breakthrough came when High Lord Asterion Venator arrived for a personal inspection of the temple. As one of the most powerful men in the Imperium, Venator wielded authority second only to Malcador himself. His word was law across 1,000 sectors, and his disapproval could condemn entire worlds to exterminatus. If anyone could shut down the temple, it would be him. But Venator's investigation took an unexpected turn. Rather than conducting a brief survey and issuing condemnation, he spent 3 days within the temple complex, speaking with Fatidicus and other leaders of the growing movement. He observed their services, examined their texts, and witnessed firsthand the phenomena that had drawn so many faithful to this place. On the 4th day, he emerged to make a pronouncement that would reshape the religious landscape of the Imperium forever. I have seen the face of the God Emperor, he declared before an assembly of Terra's most powerful leaders. I have witnessed his power at work in the hearts and minds of the faithful. What grows within that temple is not heresy or superstition, but the truest expression of loyalty to our immortal master. The proclamation sent shockwaves through the administrative hierarchy. Venator was not a man given to mystical experiences or religious enthusiasm. His endorsement of the temple carried weight that no amount of popular support could have provided. Within days, other high lords were making pilgrimage to see for themselves what had convinced such a pragmatic leader. Most left as believers. Those who did not kept their doubts to themselves, recognizing that the political winds were shifting in favor of the growing religious movement. Malcador's response came in the form of an official visit to the temple, conducted with all the ceremony due to the regent of Terra. I accompanied his escort, watching as the man who had helped plan the Imperial Truth for centuries entered a space dedicated to its complete opposite. The service that day was unlike anything I had witnessed before. 10,000 people filled the temple and the surrounding squares. Their voices joined in prayer and song that seemed to make the very air vibrate with spiritual energy. At the climax of the ceremony, as Fatidicus raised his hands in benediction, a pillar of golden light descended from the ceiling to envelop the statue of the Emperor. The light was not metaphorical or imagined. It was a physical phenomenon that registered on every sensor and detection device in the vicinity. It bathed the entire temple in radiance that made the assembled faithful appear as golden figures in a divine tableau. And from within that light came a voice, not audible to unenhanced hearing, but unmistakably present to anyone with psychic sensitivity. I am with you always, the voice said, speaking words that would become one of the fundamental prayers of the Imperial Cult. In your darkest hour, in your moment of greatest need, I am with you. Have faith, and you shall. Malcador knelt alongside 10,000 others, his ancient face wet with tears as he witnessed the final vindication of what had begun as underground heresy. The Emperor had spoken, not to condemn the worship offered in his name, but to embrace it. The Imperial Truth was officially dead, though its funeral rites would take decades to complete. The Temple of the Savior Emperor became the first legally recognized church in over 2 centuries. Within a year, similar temples were rising on worlds throughout the Imperium. Within a decade, the worship of the God Emperor had become not just permitted, but actively encouraged. Within a century, it would be mandatory. The underground faith had risen to claim its place as the official religion of the Imperium of Man. The greatest hypocrite in human history had finally become what he had always insisted he was not, the god of the species he had tried to save from godhood. Standing in the shadows of that first temple, watching the faithful pray to their divine emperor, I understood that I was witnessing the birth of something that would reshape human civilization for millennia to come. The Imperial Truth had failed not because it was poorly implemented, but because it was based upon a fundamental lie. The Emperor was divine, whether he admitted it or not, and humanity's need for something greater than themselves would not be denied by decree or suppressed by force. The temple rising was also a truth rising, the truth that gods were real, that faith had power, and that the Emperor of mankind was the greatest god humanity had ever created. 1,000 years after the heresy, I stood in the Basilica Imperialis, watching the first Ecclesiarch of the Adeptus Ministorum deliver his inaugural sermon to an assembly of the most powerful individuals in the galaxy. The ceremony itself was a masterwork of political theater, designed to signal not just the rise of a new institution, but the complete transformation of the Imperium's fundamental character. Arch-Confessor Veneris, soon to be elevated to the rank of Ecclesiarch, was a man who embodied the contradictions that the Imperial Cult had learned to embrace. A former iterator who had witnessed the fall of Horus himself, he possessed both the rhetorical skills of the old secular educators and the burning conviction of the new religious order. His sermon that day would become one of the founding documents of imperial theology, a masterpiece of doctrine that reconciled the emperor's ancient denials with his obvious divinity. We gather today not to mark a beginning, Veneris declared, his voice carrying easily through the vast space of the basilica, but to acknowledge what has always been true. The God Emperor of mankind has revealed himself to us gradually, as a teacher reveals truth to students who must grow in understanding before they can accept deeper mysteries. The assembled crowd, High Lords, Space Marine Chapter Masters, planetary governors, and representatives from every major institution of imperial authority listened with rapt attention. Many of them remembered the old days when such words would have been heretical. Now they were official doctrine, sanctioned by the highest authorities and blessed by the Emperor's own silence. In his wisdom, Veneris continued, the Master of mankind chose to walk among us as a man, to deny his divine nature, so that we might learn to serve him, not out of fear, but out of love. He allowed us to believe in the Imperial Truth because we were not ready for the Imperial faith. He tolerated our rationalism because our souls required preparation for the greater truth of his divinity. It was a masterful reframing of history, one that transformed the Emperor's hypocrisy from contradiction into divine pedagogy. The assembled listeners nodded in understanding, their faces reflecting the relief of those who had finally been given permission to believe what their hearts had always known. I watched from my position near the great doors of the basilica, noting how even the Space Marines present seemed moved by the ceremony. The Astartes had perhaps struggled most with the transition from secular crusade to religious war. Their entire purpose had been defined by the Imperial Truth, their loyalty grounded in rational service to human supremacy rather than divine command. But even they had been forced to acknowledge that faith was a more potent weapon against chaos than reason alone. Captain Valerius of the Imperial Fists stood at attention throughout the service, his yellow armor gleaming in the light of 10,000 candles. I had known him since his elevation to the First Company, had watched him struggle with the philosophical implications of the Imperium's transformation. After the ceremony, he approached me with questions I suspected he had been harboring for decades. "Tribune Corvanis," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man wrestling with uncomfortable truths. "You served the Emperor during the Great Crusade. You heard his own words denying his divinity. How are we to reconcile what we know with what we are now required to believe?" It was a question I had asked myself countless times across the centuries. The captain deserved an honest answer, even if that answer was itself a contradiction. The Emperor spoke truth when he denied his godhood, I told him, but he spoke a greater truth when he accepted worship in spite of that denial. Perhaps divinity is not something one possesses, but something one becomes through the faith of others. Perhaps the God Emperor exists not because he always was divine, but because humanity needed him to be divine. Valerius considered this, his enhanced mind grappling with concepts that existed beyond the boundaries of military doctrine. "You speak of theology, Tribune. I am a warrior. I need practical answers for practical questions. Does the Emperor answer prayers or not? Does faith provide protection against the warp or not? Do we serve a god or a man?" "All of the above," I replied, recognizing the inadequacy of the answer even as I spoke it. The Emperor is whatever he needs to be for the Imperium to survive. If humanity requires a god, then he is a god. If they need a father, he is a father. If they need a tyrant, he becomes a tyrant. His nature adapts to serve our needs, not the other way around. It was heretical thinking, even by the standards of the newly established Ecclesiarchy, but it was also, I believed, the closest thing to truth that any of us were likely to achieve. The transformation I witnessed over the following centuries was staggering in its scope and thoroughness. The Adeptus Ministorum grew from a small administrative body overseeing temple construction into one of the most powerful institutions in the Imperium. Missionary fleets carried the Imperial Cult to worlds that had never heard of the God Emperor, while cardinal worlds became centers of theological learning that rivaled the knowledge repositories of the Adeptus Mechanicus. The change was most apparent in the daily life of ordinary imperial citizens. Where once they had been educated in rational materialism and scientific method, they now learned catechisms and prayers from childhood. Where once they had been taught to question superstition and seek evidence for claims, they now accepted on faith the most extraordinary assertions about their divine ruler. I observed this transformation personally during a tour of Terra's re-education centers, where former adherents of the Imperial Truth were helped to rediscover their faith in the God Emperor. The process was not violent or coercive. Such methods would have been counterproductive. Instead, it relied on patient instruction and gradual revelation of truth. The Emperor's light illuminates all things, explained Sister Dialogus Tertia to a gathering of former tech priests who had struggled with the transition from pure rationalism to religious devotion. Science itself is a form of prayer, a way of understanding the perfection of His creation. When you repair a machine, you participate in His divine will. When you design new technology, you channel His infinite creativity. The former tech priests listened intently, their mechanical augmentations humming softly as they processed this new framework for understanding their work. Several nodded in recognition, their faces showing the relief of those who had found a way to reconcile their technical knowledge with their spiritual needs. But perhaps the most telling change was in the Imperium's approach to external threats. Where the Great Crusade had been framed as a war of human supremacy against alien oppression, the new conflicts were explicitly religious in nature. The enemies of mankind were not merely different species competing for resources, but servants of false gods seeking to corrupt humanity's divine destiny. I witnessed this change during the Macarian Crusade, when Lord Solar Macarius led the greatest military expedition since the days of the Primarchs to reclaim worlds lost during the Age of Apostasy. The propaganda that accompanied his fleets spoke not of bringing compliance to ignorant populations, but of carrying the Emperor's light to souls trapped in darkness. We do not conquer proclaimed Cardinal Militant Bucephalus during the service held aboard Macarius's flagship. We liberate. We do not destroy civilizations, we transform them. Every world we reclaim is a victory not just for the Imperium, but for the God Emperor himself. The soldiers who heard these words fought with a dedication that went beyond mere duty or loyalty. They believed themselves to be warriors in a cosmic struggle between good and evil, champions of divine truth against the forces of chaos and corruption. Their faith made them more effective fighters than any amount of training or equipment could have achieved. But faith also made them more terrible in victory. I watched imperial forces purge entire populations not out of military necessity, but out of religious obligation. Cities burned not because they harbored strategic resources, but because they contained temples to false gods. Millions died, not because they posed a threat to imperial security, but because they refused to accept the Emperor's divinity. The rational, secular state that the Emperor had built during the Great Crusade would never have countenanced such excesses. But the theocratic empire that had grown from its ashes operated by different rules, judged by different standards. Faith justified actions that reason would have condemned, and the Emperor's silence was taken as approval for any atrocity committed in his name. Standing in the Basilica Imperialis, as the first Ecclesiarch concluded his inaugural sermon, I understood that I was witnessing the completion of a transformation that had begun with Lorgar's first prayers on Colchis. The underground faith had become the supreme authority. The denied God had become the absolute tyrant. The Imperial Truth had given birth to the Imperial Lie, and that lie had consumed the galaxy. Let all humanity kneel before the golden throne, Venerus declared, as his sermon reached its climax. Let every world acknowledge the God Emperor's dominion. Let no soul deny the truth of his divinity, for in that denial lies the path to damnation. 10,000 voices rose in unison, their combined Amen shaking the very foundations of the basilica. The Ecclesiarchy had triumphed completely, and its victory was measured not in territory conquered or enemies defeated, but in the total transformation of human consciousness. We had become what the Emperor had spent 30,000 years trying to prevent us from becoming. A species enslaved by our own capacity for faith. And the greatest irony was that this enslavement was the only thing that had saved us from something far worse. The gods were real, faith had power, and the Emperor, whether he liked it or not, had become the greatest god humanity had ever known. By the 36th millennium, I had become something of a walking anachronism within the halls of the Imperial Palace. while the Adeptus Ministorum had grown into one of the most powerful institutions in the galaxy, while cardinals commanded fleets and confessors led crusades in the Emperor's name, I remained what I had always been, a witness to truth that had become too dangerous to speak aloud. The palace itself had been transformed beyond recognition, where once stark corridors had reflected the austere rationalism of the Imperial Truth. Now every surface was covered with religious iconography. Frescoes depicting the Emperor's divine ascension covered walls that had once displayed technical schematics. Shrines and prayer alcoves occupied spaces formerly reserved for strategic planning chambers. The very air hummed with constant prayer and ritual observance. I walked these transformed halls as a ghost from a discredited past, my memories of the Emperor's own words standing in stark contradiction to everything the Imperium had become. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming at times. To see the man who had personally destroyed the last church on Terra, worshipped in temples that spanned entire city blocks, to hear the being who had proclaimed the poison of faith, honored as the source of all wisdom and truth. The first time a young custodian asked me about the old days, I realized how completely history had been rewritten. Aquilian Draxes had been inducted into our ranks during the early years of the Ecclesiarchy's rise, when the transformation from secular to sacred was still in progress. His understanding of the past came filtered through the religious framework that now defined imperial education. "Tell me about the Imperial Truth, Tribune," he said as we stood watch over the approach to the throne room. "The histories say it was a necessary stage in humanity's spiritual development, a trial that prepared us for the revelation of the Emperor's true nature." I looked at him for a long moment. This warrior whose gene-forged perfection matched my own, but whose mind had been shaped by fundamentally different concepts of reality. How could I explain to him that the Imperial Truth had been genuine? That the Emperor had truly believed in the supremacy of reason over faith? That the current religious orthodoxy would have been anathema to the man we were sworn to protect? "The histories," I said carefully, "sometimes simplify complex realities." Draxes nodded eagerly, mistaking my caution for wisdom. "Of course, the truth must be revealed gradually, as the Ecclesiarchy teaches. But surely you can share some insight into the Emperor's thinking during that period. What was it like to serve a god who denied his own divinity?" The question struck at the heart of my dilemma. Was the Emperor a god who had denied his divinity, or a man who had been forced into godhood by the desperate faith of his followers? Had the Imperial Truth been a divine deception designed to prepare humanity for greater revelation? Or had it been a sincere attempt to free our species from the prison of religious thinking? I had lived through the transition, had heard the Emperor's own words, had witnessed the gradual transformation of the Imperium from secular state to theocratic empire. But even I could no longer be certain which version of events was true. Memory itself had become suspect when it contradicted the fundamental assumptions of the current age. The Emperor's ways are beyond our full comprehension, I replied, falling back on the safe platitudes that had become standard responses to such questions. We serve as we have always served, in faith and in duty. But privately, I continued to struggle with questions that grew more troubling with each passing century. The man I had sworn to protect had become something entirely different from what he had originally been, or perhaps had revealed something he had always been, but chosen to conceal. The distinction mattered because it determined whether I was serving the same master or a fundamental perversion of his original nature. The crisis came during the age of apostasy, when Goj Vandire's corrupt rule pushed the Imperium to the brink of civil war. I watched from the shadows as the Ecclesiarchy, drunk on its own power, descended into the very excesses that the Emperor had spent millennia trying to prevent. Cardinal bishops lived in decadent luxury while their flocks starved. Confessors led pogroms against suspected heretics, burning entire communities for the crime of questioning orthodox doctrine. The Frateris Templar and later the Brides of the Emperor became armies dedicated not to protecting humanity, but to enforcing religious conformity through violence. During the darkest hours of Vandire's reign, I found myself standing before the golden throne itself, staring at the withered form of my eternal master and wondering whether I was looking at humanity's savior or its greatest mistake. The Emperor's consciousness was so deeply absorbed into the throne's mechanisms that communication had become impossible. But I could not shake the feeling that some part of him was aware of what his Imperium had become. "Is this what you wanted?" I whispered into the humming silence of the throne room. "Is this the future you foresaw when you denied your divinity? Did you know that rejecting worship would make worship inevitable?" The only answer was the endless pulse of the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guided ships through the warp and sustained the Imperium's existence. Even that miracle had been transformed by religious interpretation. What had once been understood as advanced psychic technology was now explained as the Emperor's divine will made manifest. The Sebastian Thor Reformation that ended the age of apostasy brought necessary changes to the Ecclesiarchy's structure and doctrine, but it did not address the fundamental contradiction that troubled me. If anything, the new orthodoxy made the hypocrisy more explicit. The reformed Imperial Cult acknowledged that the Emperor had once denied his divinity, but framed this denial as part of a divine plan to test humanity's faith. The God Emperor walked among us as a man, declared the newly installed Ecclesiarch during the ceremonial rededication of the Basilica Imperialis. He denied his true nature so that we might prove ourselves worthy of his revelation. Those who saw through his disguise and worshipped him despite his protests demonstrated the faith that would sustain the Imperium through its darkest hours. It was a theology specifically designed to accommodate the historical record while preserving religious orthodoxy. The Emperor's atheism became divine deception. His rejection of worship became a test of devotion. His hypocrisy became a sacred mystery that only the faithful could truly understand. But I remembered the man who had spoken to Uriah Olathere in the ruins of the last church, who had insisted with genuine conviction that humanity must be freed from the tyranny of gods. I remembered the being who had proclaimed that worship was poison, that faith was weakness, that reason must triumph over superstition. That man, or God, or whatever he truly was, would have been horrified by what his Imperium had become. The final revelation of my own heretical nature came during a conversation with Trajan Valoris, the current Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes. Unlike the younger generation of guards who had been raised within the religious framework, Valoris possessed access to records and testimonies from the Emperor's own era. His questions were more pointed, his understanding more sophisticated. "You served during the Great Crusade," he said, as we reviewed security protocols for the palace's inner sanctums. "You heard the Emperor's own words about religion and faith. How do you reconcile that experience with current doctrine?" It was the question I had been dreading for millennia. The one that would force me to choose between honesty and orthodoxy. The safe answer would have been to repeat the theological explanations that had been developed to address such contradictions. But looking into Valoris's eyes, I saw the same doubt that had plagued me for thousands of years. "I don't," I admitted quietly. "I serve because duty demands it, not because faith compels it. I protect the Emperor because I swore an oath, not because I believe in his divinity. I maintain the rituals because they are expected, not because they have meaning." Valoris was quiet for a long moment, his face unreadable behind his ceremonial helm. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of understanding that suggested I was not alone in my doubts. "The Emperor protects," he said, using the standard benediction that had replaced secular farewells throughout the Imperium. "The Emperor protects," I replied, though the words felt like ash in my mouth. We understood each other perfectly. We were guardians of truth serving an empire built on lies, protectors of a God who had never wanted to be divine, keepers of faith who possessed none ourselves. We were the last heretics in a galaxy consumed by orthodoxy, and our heresy consisted of remembering what our master had actually believed, rather than what his followers needed him to have believed. The greatest irony was that our disbelief might have been exactly what the Emperor would have wanted. In a universe where gods were sustained by worship and faith, perhaps skepticism was the only way to preserve something of his original nature. Perhaps our doubt was the last remnant of the Imperial Truth, kept alive by those who had heard it from its source. But such thoughts were dangerous, bordering on the treasonous. The Imperium could not afford to have its most trusted guardians questioning the fundamental assumptions upon which its existence was based. So we kept our doubts private, maintained our vigil, and served the greatest hypocrite in human history with the loyalty he had earned through deeds, rather than the devotion he commanded through worship. In the end, perhaps that was enough. Perhaps faithless service was more valuable than faithful devotion, because it was honest in a way that worship could never be. We protected not the god emperor of imperial mythology, but the man who had tried to save humanity from the need for gods, and failed so completely that he had become the greatest god of all. "10,000 years. 10 millennia of watching the greatest lie in human history become the most necessary truth. As I stand here now in the shadow of the golden throne, feeling the weight of ages upon my enhanced frame, I finally understand the full scope of what I have witnessed. The Emperor's ultimate hypocrisy was not a flaw to be corrected or a contradiction to be resolved. It was the only possible path to humanity's survival. The realization came to me gradually, assembled from fragments of experience and observation across centuries of service. But the final piece fell into place during the 13th Black Crusade, when Abaddon's forces nearly breached the Cadian Gate, and the full horror of what awaited humanity without the Emperor's protection became unmistakably clear. I watched from the battlements of the palace as reports flooded in from across the galaxy. Demon worlds emerged from the warp to disgorge horrors beyond imagination. Reality itself became unstable as the barrier between dimensions weakened. On 1,000 worlds, populations descended into madness as their minds were touched by entities that existed beyond the reach of material law. But where the Imperial Cult had taken deepest root, where faith in the God Emperor burned brightest, the darkness was held at bay. not through superior technology or strategic planning, but through the simple power of absolute belief. Prayers became shields against demon blades. Faith turned aside psychic assaults that should have shattered mortal minds. Devotion itself became a weapon more potent than any created by human hands. I witnessed this power personally during a demon incursion that breached the palace's outer defenses, a greater demon of Tzench, weaving reality around itself like clay, advanced through corridors that should have been impregnable. Our guardian spears, weapons forged with technologies that predated the Imperium itself, could barely scratch its ever-shifting form. Then, Sister Celestine arrived with a handful of battle sisters, their armor scarred from a dozen wars, but their faith unshakable. They did not charge the demon with battle cries or tactical precision. Instead, they knelt in prayer, their voices raised in a hymn of such perfect devotion that the air itself seemed to solidify around them. The demon's advance stopped, as if it had struck an invisible wall. Its reality-warping powers, which had made a mockery of our ancient technologies, simply ceased to function in the presence of such absolute faith. It screamed in frustration, a sound that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously, then dissolved back into the immaterium as the sisters' prayers reached their crescendo. "The Emperor protects," Sister Celestine said simply as she rose from her knees, and in that moment I understood that she was speaking literal truth rather than metaphorical comfort. The Emperor did protect, not through divine intervention or miraculous power, but through the faith he had inspired in his followers. Their belief in his protection made that protection real. Their devotion to his divinity granted him the power of divinity. Their worship of him as a god transformed him into exactly what he had always claimed not to be. This was the final revelation, the understanding that had eluded me for 10 millennia. The Emperor's hypocrisy was not a failure of character, but a necessary sacrifice. He had denied his divinity not because he was not divine, but because true divinity required the free choice of the worshipped rather than the demand of the worshipper. By rejecting the easy path of proclaimed godhood, he had forced humanity to discover his divine nature through their own desperate need for something greater than themselves. By denying worship, he had made that worship more precious when it was finally given. By insisting on his humanity, he had proven his divinity more completely than any amount of divine proclamation could have achieved. The Imperial Truth had not been abandoned or corrupted. It had evolved into something greater. The truth that there were no gods had given way to the truth that humanity could create gods through the power of their collective faith. The truth that reason must triumph over superstition had been replaced by the truth that some things were too important to be left to reason alone. I thought of Uriah Olethea. The last priest who had warned the Emperor about the consequences of removing religion from human society. He had been right, but not in the way he imagined. The removal of traditional religion had not created a vacuum that needed to be filled. It had created the conditions necessary for humanity to transcend the need for external gods by creating their own. The Emperor had become divine, not despite his humanity, but because of it, his mortal origins, his denial of godhood, his very hypocrisy in claiming rationality while wielding supernatural power. All of these contradictions had been necessary to create a God worthy of human worship. A God who understood suffering because he had suffered. A God who valued sacrifice because he had sacrificed. A God who protected humanity because he was fundamentally and eternally human himself. Standing here now, surrounded by the endless prayers and rituals that sustain the Golden Throne, I can see the threads that connect every moment of this 10,000-year journey. Lorgar's first prayers on Colchis, written in defiance of his father's commands. Euphrates miracles aboard the vengeful spirit, performed through faith rather than training. The underground cult networks that spread through the great crusade fleets, sustained by need rather than doctrine. The temple of the Savior Emperor rising from the ashes of the Imperial Truth like a phoenix born from its own destruction. Each event had seemed like a contradiction, a failure of the rational system the Emperor had tried to create, but taken together, they formed a pattern of inevitable transformation. Humanity needed gods, and when their gods failed them, they created new ones. The Emperor had simply ensured that when they created their god, it would be something worthy of their devotion, rather than another cosmic parasite feeding on their desperation. The price of this transformation was the Emperor's own eternal torment. Bound to the Golden Throne by necessity rather than choice, sustained by the faith of those who would never understand the sacrifice he had made, he had become the prisoner of his own success. The God who had never wanted to be divine was trapped in divinity by the very followers he had tried to protect from such slavery. But perhaps that too was part of the design. Perhaps the Emperor's suffering was what made him truly worthy of worship, not because he demanded it, but because he endured it for the sake of those who could not bear the full weight of truth. His hypocrisy shielded humanity from the terrible knowledge that their survival depended on the enslavement of the very being they had created to protect them. I am Aurelius Corvanus, tribune of the Adeptus Custodes, and I have served the greatest hypocrite in human history for 10,000 years. I have watched him deny his divinity while performing miracles, reject worship while inspiring absolute devotion, proclaim reason while embodying mystery. I have seen the Imperial Truth transform into the Imperial Cult, watched secular rationalism give birth to theocratic orthodoxy, witnessed the destruction of religion led inevitably to the creation of the most powerful religious movement in galactic history. And now, at the end of my long vigil, I understand that none of it was contradiction. It was transformation. The Emperor had not failed to prevent humanity from falling into religious slavery. He had ensured that when they chose such slavery, it would be to a master who truly loved them rather than one who merely consumed them. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, as Uriah Olathair once observed. But sometimes, when the alternative is a hell paved with malicious intent, the road built from goodness becomes the only path to salvation. The Emperor protects, not because he is a god, but because humanity needed him to become one. Not because he sought worship, but because we required something worthy of our devotion. Not because he was hypocritical, but because our survival demanded the kind of loving deception that only the greatest hypocrite in history could provide. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but there is also faith, and in that faith, kindled by denial and sustained by contradiction, burns the last light of humanity's hope. The God Emperor's ultimate hypocrisy was not his failure. It was his greatest gift to the species he had chosen to protect, whether they understood that protection or not. The greatest liar had become our eternal truth. And in that truth, no matter how born of lies, we had found something worth preserving across the dark millennia of an unforgiving universe. The incense has burned down to nothing, and new acolytes come to replace the sacred braziers, as they have every hour for 10,000 years. Their faces are young, unmarked by the weight of terrible knowledge, bright with the certainty of faith that I can no longer feel. They see in me what they expect to see, a guardian of the golden throne, a protector of their divine emperor, a faithful servant of the Imperium's sacred mission. They do not see the heretic that I have become. They cannot perceive the doubt that gnaws at my enhanced consciousness like a slow poison. To them, I am simply what I appear to be, an ancient custodian who has stood watch over their god for longer than their world has existed, and perhaps that is for the best. Perhaps the truth of what I know, what I remember, what I have witnessed across these endless millennia is too dangerous to be shared. Perhaps some knowledge is meant to die with those who possess it, buried beneath the weight of duty and the necessity of service. I think sometimes of writing it all down, the real history, the true account of how the Emperor's greatest defeat became humanity's only victory. But to what end? The scribes would classify it as heretical. The Inquisition would burn it as dangerous, and the faithful would reject it as lies. The truth has become too terrible for anyone to bear, save those of us who lived through its creation. So I keep my vigil, standing guard over the corpse of a god who never wanted to be divine, protecting the faith of those who can never understand the sacrifice that sustains them. I watch the endless stream of pilgrims who come to pray before the golden throne, their voices raised in adoration of a being who would weep to see what his imperium has become. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night cycle, when the palace grows quiet and the prayers fade to whispers, I imagine I can hear him, not the divine emperor of imperial mythology, but the man who once walked among us denying his own nature. He speaks no words of wisdom or divine commandment. He simply sighs, a sound so filled with weariness and regret that it would break the hearts of the faithful if they could hear it. But they cannot hear it, and perhaps that too is mercy. The Emperor protects them from the truth of his suffering as surely as his suffering protects them from the darkness that would otherwise consume the galaxy. His hypocrisy shields them from the knowledge that their salvation was purchased with the eternal torment of the being they worship. 10,000 years of service, 10,000 years of watching the greatest lie in human history become the most necessary truth. 10,000 years of being guardian to a god who never wanted to be a god, serving an empire built on the ashes of everything its founder believed. And I will serve for 10,000 more, because duty demands it. Because someone must remember what was lost when divinity was gained. Because in a universe filled with the faithful and the faithless, someone must carry the burden of being both, believing in the Emperor's power while knowing the price of that power, serving his divinity while mourning his humanity, protecting his lies while honoring his truth. I am Aurelius Corvanis, tribune of the Adeptus Custodes, the last keeper of forbidden knowledge in an empire that has forgotten how to question its own foundation. I stand watch over the greatest hypocrite in human history. And I understand at last that this hypocrisy was not his failure. It was his greatest gift to a species too weak to save itself. The Emperor protects, and I protect the Emperor. And in that endless circle of protection and service, we preserve something precious against the dying of the light, not truth. For truth has proven too dangerous for humanity to bear. But hope that somewhere in the darkness ahead, the lies we tell ourselves will prove strong enough to carry us through to something better. The vigil continues. It will always continue. And in that continuation, the Emperor's ultimate victory is complete. Not the triumph of truth over falsehood, but the triumph of love over honesty, of mercy over justice, of the kind of beautiful lie that makes existence bearable in a universe too terrible for unadorned truth. The incense burns eternal. The prayers never cease. And the greatest hypocrite in human history remains forever on his throne, dying, undying, protecting those who can never know the real price of their protection. This is the final truth, and it will remain forever unspoken. The Emperor protects.